end. Nearer and fairer she came, in the glow of the morning light. The most startling, the most unanswerable contradiction that eye could see or mind conceive to the description in the rector's letter. Both governess and pupil were close to the summer house before they looked that way, and noticed Midwinter standing inside. The governess saw him first. "A friend of yours, Miss Milroy?" she asked quietly, without starting or betraying any sign of surprise. Neelie recognized him instantly. Prejudiced against Midwinter by his conduct when his friend had introduced him at the cottage, she now fairly detested him as the unlucky first cause of her misunderstanding with Allan at the picnic. Her face flushed, and she drew back from the summer house with an expression of merciless surprise. "He is a friend of Mr. Armadale's," she replied, sharply. "I don't know what he wants, or why he is here." "A friend of Mr. Armadale's?" The governess's face lighted up with a suddenly roused interest as she repeated the words. She returned Midwinter's look, still steadily fixed on her, with equal steadiness on her side. "For my part," pursued Neelie, resenting Midwinter's insensibility to her presence on the scene, "I think it a great liberty to treat papa's garden as if it were the open park." The governess turned round, and gently interposed. "My dear Miss Milroy," she remonstrated, "there are certain distinctions to be observed. This gentleman is a friend of Mr. Armadale's. You could hardly express yourself more strongly if he was a perfect stranger." "I express my opinion," retorted Neelie, chafing under the satirically indulgent tone in which the governess addressed her. "It's a matter of taste, Miss Gwilt, and tastes differ." She turned away petulantly, and walked back by herself to the cottage. "She is very young," said Miss Gwilt, appealing with a smile to Midwinter's forbearance; "and, as you must see for yourself, sir, she is a spoiled child." She paused, showed, for an instant only, her surprise at Midwinter's strange silence and strange persistency in keeping his eyes still fixed on her, then set herself, with a charming grace and readiness, to help him out of the false position in which he stood. "As you have extended your walk thus far," she resumed, "perhaps you will kindly favor me, on your return, by taking a message to your friend? Mr. Armadale has been so good as to invite me to see the Thorpe Ambrose gardens this morning. Will you say that Major Milroy permits me to accept the invitation, in company with Miss Milroy, between 10 and 11 o'clock?" For a moment her eyes rested, with a renewed look of interest, on Midwinter's face. She waited, still in vain, for an answering word from him, smiled, as if his extraordinary silence amused rather than angered her, and followed her pupil back to the cottage. It was only when the last trace of her had disappeared that Midwinter roused himself, and attempted to realize the position in which he stood. The revelation of her beauty was in no respect answerable for the breathless astonishment which had held him spellbound up to this moment. The one clear impression she had produced on him thus far began and ended with his discovery of the astounding contradiction that her face offered, in one feature after another, to the description in Mr. Brock's letter. All beyond this was vague and misty, a dim consciousness of a tall, elegant woman, and of kind words, modestly and gracefully spoken to him, and nothing more. He advanced a few steps into the garden without knowing why, stopped, glancing hither and thither like a man lost, recognized the summer house by an effort, as if years had elapsed since he had seen it, and made his way out again, at last, into the park. Even here he wandered first in one direction, then in another. His mind was still reeling under the shock that had fallen on it; his perceptions were all confused. Something kept him mechanically in action, walking eagerly without a motive, walking he knew not where. A far less sensitively organized man might have been overwhelmed, as he was overwhelmed now, by the immense, the instantaneous revulsion of feeling which the event of the last few minutes had wrought in his mind. At the memorable instant when he had opened the door of the summer house, No confusing influence troubled his faculties. In all that related to his position toward his friend, he had reached an absolutely definite conclusion by an absolutely definite process of thought. The whole strength of the motive which had driven him into the resolution to part from Allan rooted itself in the belief that he had seen at Hurle Mere the fatal fulfillment of the first vision of the dream. And this belief, in its turn, rested necessarily on the conviction that the woman who was the one survivor of the tragedy in Madeira must be also inevitably the woman whom he had seen standing in the Shadow's place at the pool. Firm in that persuasion, he had himself compared the object of his distrust and of the rector's distrust with the description written by the rector himself, a description carefully minute, by a man entirely trustworthy, and his own eyes had informed him that the woman whom he had seen at the Mere, and the woman whom Mr. Brock had identified in London, were not one, but two. In the place of the dream shadow there had stood, on the evidence of the rector's letter, not the instrument of the fatality, but a stranger. No such doubts as might have troubled a less superstitious man were started in his mind by the discovery that had now opened on him. It never occurred to him to ask himself whether a stranger might not be the appointed instrument of the fatality, now when the letter had persuaded him that a stranger had been revealed as the figure in the dream landscape. No such idea entered or could enter his mind. The one woman whom his superstition dreaded was the woman who had entwined herself with the lives of the two Armadales in the first generation, and with the fortunes of the two Armadales in the second, who was at once the marked object of his father's deathbed warning, and the first cause of the family calamities which had opened Allan's way to the Thorpe Ambrose estate, the woman, in a word, whom he would have known instinctively, but for Mr. Brock's letter, to be the woman whom he had now actually seen. Looking at events as they had just happened, under the influence of the misapprehension into which the rector had innocently misled him, his mind saw and seized its new conclusion instantaneously, acting precisely as it had acted in the pastime of his interview with Mr. Brock at the Isle of Man. Exactly as he had once declared it to be an all-sufficient refutation of the idea of the fatality that he had never met with the timber ship in any of his voyages at sea, so he now seized on the similarly derived conclusion that the whole claim of the dream to a supernatural origin stood self-refuted by the disclosure of a stranger in the Shadow's place. Once started from this point, once encouraged to let his love for Allan influence him undividedly again, his mind hurried along the whole resulting chain of thought at lightning speed. If the dream was proved to be no longer a warning from the other world, it followed inevitably that accident, and not fate, had led the way to the night on the wreck, and that all the events which had happened since Allan and he had parted from Mr. Brock were events in themselves harmless, which his superstition had distorted from their proper shape. In less than a moment his mobile imagination had taken him back to the morning at Castletown, when he had revealed to the rector the secret of his name, when he had declared to the rector, with his father's letter before his eyes, the better faith that was in him. Now once more he felt his heart holding firmly by the bond of brotherhood between Allan and himself. Now once more he could say with the eager sincerity of the old time, "If the thought of leaving him breaks my heart, the thought of leaving him is wrong." As that nobler conviction possessed itself again of his mind, quieting the tumult, clearing the confusion within him, the house at Thorpe Ambrose, with Allan on the steps, waiting, looking for him, opened on his eyes through the trees. A sense of illimitable relief lifted his eager spirit high above the cares, and doubts, and fears that had oppressed it so long, and showed him once more the better and brighter future of his early dreams. His eyes filled with tears, and he pressed the rector's letter, in his wild, passionate way, to his lips, as he looked at Allan through the vista of the trees. "But for this morsel of paper," he thought, "my life might have been one long sorrow to me, and my father's crime might have parted us forever." Such was the result of the stratagem which had